Good evening and welcome to the inaugural lecture in St. Lawrence's new online Laurentian lecture series. My name is Kim Hissong and I'm the Executive Director of the Annual Giving and Laurentian Engagement Office here at St. Lawrence and a member of the class of 1994, and I will serve as the moderator for tonight's lecture. Before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few technical items. Because we have over 200 alumni parents and friends who indicated that they would be joining us for the lecture tonight, we are going to hold questions until the end. At that time, if you'd like to ask a question, you'll have the ability to quote-unquote raise your hand using the hand icon in the navigation pane that you should see at the top right of your screen. A few tips about the webinar audio. If you are using the audio through your computer, please know that you must have a built-in microphone or an external microphone in order to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Otherwise, you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. If you are using telephone audio, please know that if you're using your phone speaker, in order for us to hear your question, you will likely need to take the speaker off during that time. All participants will be muted during the webinar until the question and answer time begins. We recommend that during the PowerPoint presentation, you minimize the navigation pane that you should be seeing in the upper right-hand corner of your screen by using the orange arrow near the top to minimize the pane. If you need to maximize the pane at any point in time to ask a question, simply use the orange arrow to maximize the pane again. Just a note that a full audio recording of this webinar will be posted to our website in the days following tonight's lecture. So without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our lecturer for the evening, Dr. Alan Searleman, Charles A. Dana Professor of Psychology. Dr. Searleman graduated Phi Beta Kappa from UMass Amherst with a BS degree in psychology and a PhD from SUNY at Stony Brook in experimental psychology. He came directly to St. Lawrence University after graduate school in 1978. In 1989, was promoted to full professor, and then in 2007 was elected by the faculty to become the first Charles A. Dana Professor of Psychology. He was chair of the psychology department for 8 years during the 1990s. His main research interests are in left-handedness, human memory, and visual illusions. He has published 2 books on human memory and dozens of articles on a range of topics in psychology. Tonight's lecture is entitled Left-Handedness, Some Interesting Things I've Learned After 30 Years of Research. Welcome, Dr. Searleman.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that great introduction. And I'd like to thank all of those of you who've tuned in tonight. Kim was nice enough to share with me the list of people who have signed up for tonight. And it's really a lot of fun for me to look back and see some names I recognize from 35 years ago even. All right, let's get into this a little bit. On the first slide, you can see one of my favorite artists, M.C. Escher. Escher was, in fact, left-handed. And as some of you might know, I teach a course called Sensation and Perception, and Escher is world famous for his work on illusions and making these unbelievable drawings. This particular drawing of drawing hands, this 48 lithograph, my wife bought for me when I first started doing this work about 35 years ago, and it proudly hangs in my office in Valentine right now. All right, let's get started a little bit and see if I can inform you about left-handedness. Here's the first thing. Maybe you didn't know, but there's a special day just for left-handers. August 13th is International Left-Handers Day. And it's interesting because sometimes they go out to great lengths to sort of publicize this. And several years ago, I did a live broadcast from London. I was sitting in my Canton office, and the BBC contacted me, and we talked about left-handedness. Everything was going fine. My only problem was trying to understand some of the accents. I'm going, oh, what did he say? What did she say? But that was a lot of fun. All right, let's get into some facts about left-handedness. First of all, about 10 to 12% of the population is left-handed, and that's if the culture is permitted. We will talk more about that in a few minutes. We also know that males are slightly more likely to be left-handed than are females. Most right-handers are strongly right-handed. And let me say right from the very beginning, I am a right-handed, strongly right-handed person. I often get the question, well, how come you're doing work on left-handedness? It all started actually back in graduate school at Stony Brook. When I first got there, My primary interest was in higher intellectual functions like intelligence, memory, learning, and why there were such big individual differences among people. And one of the first things I realized was it turned out that handedness was an important variable. And ever since then, I've been captured by handedness. And a lot of my work has been doing just this kind of work. Okay, so I make the claim that right-handers are generally very strongly handed, but most left-handers are not strongly left-handed. And I ask the question, why? If I could actually see you, I'm sure a lot of left-handers would be raising their hand right now, and they'd probably all chime in and say, here's the reason why. The world is made for right-handers. And unfortunately, that is true. Let's take a look at some of the evidence for this. Some of it is sort of just minor hassles you have in life. So you might recognize the St. Lawrence beer sign. So suppose you take it down to the TikTok, and if you're right-handed, you have them fill it up, and okay, it's fine. But if you're left-handed and you pick that up, the logo is backwards and you don't see the logo. It's a small little thing, but if you're left-handed, you see this all the time. I also have a couple of rulers, and as you might, the top one is a typical ruler, and if you're a right-hander, you don't give much thought to it. If you want to, say, trace like 7 or 8 inches, you just go to the very beginning and you pull your hand across. If you try to do that as a left-hander, though, your hand blocks the numbers. You can't do it. You can contort your hand in a strange way, and we'll talk about this in a little while, actually. But again, that's difficult to do also. So, of course, there's a whole cottage industry out there. So you can buy left-handed rulers, and I like this one, left-hander's rule, okay? I like the little pun there. Okay, these are minor things. Let's take a look at some other aspects of handedness, though. Some of these are more important. Scissors. Probably 99% of all scissors that have ever been made are made for the right hand. If you happen to have a pair and you open it up, you'll see the cutting edge is always on the right side. Yes, as a left-hander you can use those, but not nearly as well as if you tried an actual left-handed pair of scissors. And I have some, and I've given them to left-handers, and they're sometimes amazed at how much easier they are to use. But again, they get used to it because they live in a right-handed world. Something a little bit more important is power tools. Many tools like lathes and circular saws and so forth, they're designed ergonomically for right-handers. And so safety switches, like to hit with your thumb real quickly, are often for the right hand. And I have a colleague who's done a lot of work in this area, and left-handers are much more likely to have accidents using these things because, again, sometimes you have to make a quick move, and it's just not easy to do if you're left-handed. School desks. Many school desks come with a fixed desk part, normally for the right-handers. I'm happy to say that actually I'm piloting in one of the Valentine rooms right now a new kind of desk, which might be used widely at St. Lawrence if it gets a nod from us. And what's nice about this, it's a nice flat surface, but you can flip it back and forth. So if you're right-handed or left-handed, you can switch to either way, which is really nice to do. Many desks aren't like that. I know when I was at UMass Amherst, I had a friend who was one of these poor left-handers. He made it a point of running around St. Lawrence, around UMass Amherst, trying to make sure there were enough left-handed desks, and he got through most of the campus before he graduated, actually. Sports equipment. Again, there's, as I said, there's an industry out there. If you want to golf, there's left-handed golf clubs. There's sports mitts like for baseball and so forth out there. Again, if you just pick up a mitt, generally speaking, if you're left-handed, it's not going to fit you very well. Even a computer mouse, oftentimes they're made so the thumbnail part of it is made for the right hand. You can buy them, which they're ambidextrous. And even that term, ambidextrous, you see the bias there, ambi-two-dextrous, meaning two right hands. So even if you have equal felicity with each hand, again, this is bias for the right hand. All right. One of our alums, John, soon after it was announced I was going to be doing this webinar, contacted me via email and said he had been listening to a professor talk a few years ago down in Florida, and this person said that, sorry, left-handers, but typically left-handers die early. And John was wondering, is this true? And it was sort of ironic, he said, because he was talking to a lot of retirees, and many of them, once they heard about left-handedness, were there, and there were a lot of older left-handers there. So how did this all get started? First of all, is this true? The answer is no. I can say that categorically no. All right? And how it got started actually is with a colleague of mine. Dr. Stanley Coren. Stan is now retired, but he was a professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he published some work in the early 1990s, a couple studies, and he claimed that there was good evidence that there are fewer older left-handers because they died early. And we're not talking a month or two early. He was claiming several years early. Now, at this point, Stan and I, as I said, were colleagues, and we probably had published about a dozen papers together. Actually spent 3 summers out in British Columbia at his house doing work with him, so I knew him very well. And unfortunately, this caused a rift in our professional relationship because I just did not agree with him. I'm not going to get technical, but some of the statistical analysis he used I didn't agree with. And in addition, Stan didn't take into account that many left-handers, when they were children, were forced to become right-handed. So yes, you might be 80 years old now and you consider yourself a right-hander, but you might have no recollection at all that when you were 4 years old, you were forced to change. So as I said, and it's not just me, others agree also, left-handers, you do not die earlier. So rest assured. All right, let's talk a little bit about the bad press that left-handers get. And a lot of that bad press comes from, I'm afraid, right-handers. This has gone into myths, cultures, most religions. The very word right, from the English word right, comes from the Old English rift, and the connotation was good, proper, fitting, correct. Okay? How about the word for left? Well, unfortunately, the word for left comes from the Anglo-Saxon list, and the connotation is broken or weak. Okay? And let's take a look at some other languages. The word sinister is the Latin word for left, and as we know, it also means someone who is evil. In French, the word gauche means left, and we also know that means an awkward, socially clumsy kind of person. In Italian, mancino is the word for left-handed man, but it has the connotation also of thief. Okay? In Spanish, there's an idiom, no te vero, to be very clever, but the actual literal translation of this is not to be left-handed. So again, you can see these are just sort of major languages in the prejudice against the left side. And you can find this in almost every language you look at. What I'd like to do now is just give you a few of the typical derogatory things that are often bandied about left-sidedness. Some of these you will have heard of, and I'm just leaving out a bunch, but here's a few. So for example, you've probably heard of the notion of a left-handed compliment. In reality, that means no compliment at all. If you give somebody left-handed flattery, that's insincere flattery, so you don't really mean it. If you say somebody is left-handed, typically it often translates into meaning the person is not trustworthy, not just that they biologically prefer their left hand. The left hand of fortune means you've got bad luck. If you extend to somebody the left hand of friendship, it alludes to a false friend. To marry with the left hand is a common expression meaning you marry below your station. And finally, to see with the left eye means you have faulty perception. So again, you can get the feel of this. And again, if you're left-handed, you've probably been subjected to some of these things over your time. All right, let's take a look at some of the, again, the myths and cultures around handedness and how it affects everyday life. So think of your wedding ring, right? I've got a wedding ring on right now. They're traditionally worn on the left hand. And you might, well, why the left hand? Maybe because most people are right-handed and you want to free your right hand up to doing things. Well, the best explanation that we seem to have is that once you're married, you are literally off the market, right? You should not be tempted by others. And the notion is that there's always a temptation out there, this adulterous temptation. And the thought is that the left side of the body is more vulnerable to these temptations. So the wedding ring is actually like an amulet or charm to say, stay away. And since you need more protection on the left side, that's why we wear it on the left side. The Pledge of Allegiance, even, right? When children are taught the Pledge of Allegiance, they always are taught to put your right hand over your heart. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen somebody put their left hand over their heart. You can do it, but again, the general way of doing it is putting your hand over your heart with the right hand. Even in the court of law, all right, when you're in a court, you're swearing on a Bible sometimes, you always raise the right hand. So in the left corner, I just have a woman there, and she's got her right hand raised. But on the other side there's President Obama. Obama is left-handed. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And this is during his first inauguration. You can see how young his children are there. And notice, right, he's raised his right hand. He's the most powerful person on earth, and yet he still is raising his right hand because that is the general stricture of things. In terms of religion, traditional Muslims, it's an insult to touch them with the left hand. When you walk into the bathroom, if you're a traditional Muslim, you walk into the bathroom with your left foot. I don't know about you, but when I'm walking around, I don't think very much of this, but they do. The right foot is very consciously used to walk in and enter into a mosque. Okay? Many African countries and cultures also think very highly of the right hand and do not think very highly of the left hand. The reason I picked Ghana is, as some of you might know, my daughter-in-law is from Ghana. She spent the first 12 years of her life there, and she moved to New York City and eventually ended up at Clarkson, where my son was at school there too, and they met, and well, now we have her and our family, and we have a new 3-week-old grandson, actually. So I just went out to see him in St. Louis recently. So I thought it would be nice to know something more about Ghana. So a few years ago, I went to their website, and this is the official website of Ghana. And so as you scroll down this a little bit, you'll see things about visas and how to get to Ghana, and the climate, a lot better than Canton, electricity, the currency, and so forth. And the typical kinds of things you see, and I'm learning a lot here. But as we get further down, something, of course, caught my eye. And as you'll see in a moment, near the very end here, right, we're at greetings and so forth. We're almost there, good morning, and so forth. And right here, okay, it says use of the left hand. Now get this. This is on their official tourism page, showing you how much they think about this. So they say, the left hand has limited functions in Ghana. In fact, the use of the left hand for certain activities is considered an anathema. That is one reason why, when our men wear traditional cloth, we throw the fabric over the left hand. In particular, avoid receiving or giving, gesticulating in speech, waving at a person, or pointing things out with the left hand. If you are naturally left-handed, it is not your fault. It is no offense. I love that. It's no offense. It's not your fault. But nonetheless, you can avoid public embarrassment of complications by giving something, for example, your guidebook, your camera, your souvenir, with the left hand. So again, you can see how important this must be to them if they're actually telling tourists that they have to be careful about using the left hand. And I've talked to my daughter-in-law, Sylvia, and she says, for example, yeah, she doesn't try to cook with the left hand, try to do anything with the left hand, pretty much. And she knows it's a little strange, but I'm, of course, very interested in that. Going away from traditional Muslim, Jewish and Christian clergy always give benedictions and blessings with the right hand. So here's the sign of the cross given by Pope Benedict. I tried to find a new picture of the newest Pope, Pope Francis, but I searched the internet. I can't find him yet doing the sign of the cross. But the sign of the cross is always done with the right hand. Whether or not you yourself might be left-handed, you are taught to do it with the right hand. In addition, staying with this religious thing, those of you who are left-handed and went to school in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, and perhaps had a Catholic upbringing in school, will remember how the nuns would berate left-handed children. They would often associate the left hand with the devil, and so you have a second or third grader whose hand, left hand, if they tried to use it to write, would actually get slapped, sometimes be put behind their back, and there are many stories that people can tell about this. One of the things I've done in my own research is we look to see who is most likely to be forced to change. Typically, it occurs before about age 8. it's usually by a teacher or by a parent, particularly if it's a left-handed parent who's had a difficult time being left-handed. He or she will try to change the child. We know that males are more likely to get pressure to change than females are. So little boys are more likely to get pressure than little girls are. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it is not. And I've heard horror stories from left-handers on how forceful sometimes this conversion to right-handedness might be. There's actually a woman right now in Germany who has these clinics set up throughout Germany to re-educate left-handers into becoming back in people who were left-handers who were switched to right-handed, to switch back to left-handedness. She believes that this has caused many of them undue stress and depression, and this is actually a very going concern right now in Germany. All right, one last thing is how religion, the devil is almost always depicted as being left-handed. This goes way, way back. I think we'll find a book, this is a big opus about demons and witches and so forth, back to 1608. And if you notice, there's the devil, and he's using his left hand to sort of baptize his minions. So again, this goes way, way back. All right, so if you remember anything from tonight, here's the key point, right? In almost anything you can think of, left-handers are more variable than our right-handers. And let's start off with some research I did in my lab on sexual maturation. So a few years ago, we were able to contact about 1,200 first-year students. This was actually done with Stanley Cohen, the person who said left-handers die early. And what we did was we asked them about onset of puberty. So for the women, and they're about 18, we asked them about when was your first menstrual period. This is something that most women can remember, especially only a few years apart. We often call this a flashbulb memory. You've got a clear memory of when it happened, where you were, and so forth. We also asked about body growth spurts, onset of adult pubic hair, and so forth. We did the same thing with males. Obviously, we don't have anything quite as analogous as onset of menstruation. But again, we were asking questions about when did your voice break, to the best of your knowledge, when did you have a growth spurt, and so forth. And our prediction, which came true, is that, again, on average, left-handers are pretty similar to right-handers. But if you look at the extremes, that's where you'll see the differences. So for instance, if you look at the top or bottom quartile, so the top quartile are those males and females who delayed sexually quite late. So for example, it might be a woman who has her first menstrual period at age 15. Today it's around 11 and a half or 12 typically. Or somebody who had abnormally early, like at age 8. Okay? And what we found was that approximately twice as many left-handers as you'd expect by chance, so much more than that 10 or 12%, were either abnormally delayed or early starters. So again, that's just one example of how left-handers are more variable than right-handers are. All right? Let's take a look at some other things. And at first, left-handers are not going to like this. I will even it up, I promise. All right, left-handers are overrepresented in people with intellectual disabilities. This is a study I did at St. Lawrence, and some of you might remember Dr. Thomas Cunningham. Tom was a long-time member of the psychology department. He's been retired for about 10 years, although he still teaches one course for us each year in the fall. So the term intellectual disability is the term we now prefer to use instead of mental retardation. But what we did back in the 80s, and we were one of the first ones to show this, and it's been replicated about 4 or 5 times, is we got a group of about 90 children, actually about from age 14 to 19, who had IQs below 70. And of these 90, we had the people who worked with them, because we didn't want to scare them or make them upset, do simple tasks. So they would hand them a ball and say, throw me the ball. And again, we would look to see which hand was throwing the ball. We'd hand them a crayon and say, draw a circle. Again, we look to see which hand was drawing the circle and so forth. We also compared them with 212 Canton and Potsdam high school students, people of normal intelligence. And what we found was 2 interesting things. One, about 24% of the population of those who had intellectual disabilities were left-handed. That's huge. It's almost 1 in 4. In addition, the lower their IQs. So again, most of the people were had mild intellectual disabilities. Some had moderate. As you went further down, the likelihood of being left-handed went up. In addition, across all of the kids who had these intellectual disabilities, even if they themselves are right-handed, they often have what we call familial sinistrality. It's a fancy word meaning left-handers in your family. So again, just even having a single left-hander in your family made it more likely that you have a lower IQ. And again, like I said, this is done right here in St. Lawrence County. Some other examples of left-handers being overrepresented in certain clinical populations in terms of people who have epilepsy, very well known, dyslexia, stuttering, schizophrenia. We've shown there's a good deal of evidence that left-handers are more likely to suffer from alcoholism. And here's another one, which is kind of an interesting one, criminality. In terms of the more severe the crime, the more likely the person is to be left-handed. Again, there's correlational data, clearly. We're not talking cause and effect. But still, they are overrepresented in these groups, and this comes out consistently. I like this quote from a fairly famous Italian criminologist way back over 100 years ago. Let me just read this to you. Well, what is sure is that criminals are more often left-handed than honest men, and lunatics are more sensitively left-sided than either of these are two. So not only do they slam left-handers as being more likely to be criminals, but also more likely to be crazy lunatics. Okay, now to the good stuff. On the plus side for left-handers, they are more likely to have a very high IQ, especially in terms of mathematics. They've done a variety of studies. A lot of these have been done at Johns Hopkins University, where they get these precocious kids, and they're testing them at 7th and 8th grade. And those who score way up, like over 700 in the SATs, are much more likely to be left-handed. Again, as I said before, left-handers are more variable, so they appear at both ends of the spectrum, very low IQ, very high IQ. And I put in here an SOU faculty meeting back in, I guess, late 80s, I think it was. And at one point, I stood up in front of a faculty meeting, just sort of getting started, and there's probably about 90 or 95 faculty members there. And I said, if you're left-handed or consider yourself left-handed, would you please raise your hand? And I did a quick count. I think I came up with about 23% of the faculty are left-handed. Now, if you will grant us maybe that some of us with PhDs and so forth, maybe we are on the higher end of the spectrum. Again, this is another example that left-handers tend to fall at extremes of IQ ranges. We also know left-handers are beyond their typical numbers, are top-flight artists and musicians. Part of this is because, in a sense, we really have two brains, a right and left hemisphere. I'm sure many of you have heard about right and left hemispheres. The hemispheres for left-handers are more coordinated than in general than is true for right-handers. There's a structure called the corpus callosum. It's 200 million fibers which connect the two hemispheres. For left-handers, there's more crosstalk between the hemispheres, and oftentimes that leads to more creative endeavors. And in addition, left-handers are more likely to succeed as professional athletes. This is for sure true in certain sports like fencing, boxing. Oftentimes, this is because of the surprise factor. Even take tennis. If you play tennis, if you're a right-hander and you hit a ball to your opponent, and you think you're going to hit it to their weak backhand, or if you're playing against a left-hander, that's their strong forehand. Boom! And so it's often the surprise factor. Same thing with boxers. They often, most boxers say they don't like to fight southpaws, that's the name for left-handers, because they don't see them very often. And so punches and fighting stances come from angles they're not prepared for. Interestingly, other left-handers also don't like to fight other left-handers because, again, they're not used to fighting other left-handers either. And so they try not to fight them. Okay, in my promo to you, I teased you and I asked you what sport is it illegal to play left-handed? And if you got it right, you said horse polo. All right? It's considered so dangerous when you're on a horse to not use your right hand that it's actually illegal to play horse polo. Prince Charles, perhaps the next king of England, is left-handed. He's a horse polo player, and sure enough, he plays with the right hand. Now, I bet several of you said, wait a minute, what about field hockey? And if you put field hockey, I can give you lots of credit. It's not quite as like horse polo, but if you play field hockey, you might realize that the stick is set up so that the flat end is only on the right side, and you have to play it with the right hand. It's almost impossible to play field hockey with the left hand. There are field hockey sticks made for left-handers, but they're pointless because they're illegal to play with in international play. And so if you have a son or daughter, particularly in this country, most people who are playing field hockey are women. It's not that case like in India and other places, mostly men. But if you have a child who's left-handed, this is probably not the right sport to go into. So, all right. Let's talk about a major difference between right-handers and left-handers, which can be serious at times. The term aphasia is used to express the loss of language due to brain damage. And let me just go a little bit. I won't get into too much brain detail here. But there's a very famous case, a famous patient called Tan. Paul Broca was a physician in France, and he was seeing lots of patients. And at one point, this person named Tan came under his awareness. And the reason why the person was called Tan is that's all the thing he could say. We go Tan, 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 I assume in French, and a few days later he died. Upon autopsy, Broca looked and found that he had damage done to a small area. You can see it on this video, on the map here. It's now called Broca's area. People who have Broca's aphasia have trouble speaking, articulation. They can speak in short, choppy sentences and sort of get it out. It's very difficult to understand them. There's another section there you might see Wernicke's area, named for Carl Wernicke. This is just the opposite. These people can speak fluently, very nicely, but they have no idea what they're saying. So they can't understand speech. Okay? So this turns out to be a major difference between right-handers and left-handers in terms of aphasia. Let's take a look a little closer. What we know today, and actually I contributed some of this research in the 70s, 95 to 99% of all right-handers have mostly left hemisphere language. And by left hemisphere language, I'm particularly referring to speech output. Speech is a very sequential process. You want only one hemisphere gaining control over it to have nice output. One of the reasons why we said before left-handers often stutter, both hemispheres sometimes try to gain control of the speech musculature. You can't do that, and that sometimes brings out a stutter. So the question is, and I should say, again, most left hemisphere language, there is some language ability in the right hemisphere, and in fact, the very first paper ever published was a review of right hemisphere linguistic ability. So it does have some ability, especially in terms of like humor and metaphor and rhythm. But again, for the most part, especially with speech, it's the left hemisphere. So the question is, are left-handers the mirror image? Okay, do they have all this stuff going on in the right hemisphere? And the answer is, we know this from clinical work, is no. And in fact, what we know today is 50 to 70% of left-handers also have mostly left hemisphere language. And the $64,000 question, of course, is, what about those other 30 to 50%? And that's really important because if you are a left-hander, and if at some point you need brain surgery, the neurosurgeon needs to know where is language stored for you primarily. And if they know which hemisphere it's stored in, they'll avoid taking out more than they absolutely must take. So some people are left with this difficult decision to make. Do I make sure I get all the tumor out, or do I risk having this person become aphasic? It's a difficult situation to be in. We're going to get back to that in a moment, but I first want to get back to actually President Obama. So if you look at Obama, and many left-handers will probably go, oh yeah, I recognize this, he has an inverted writing posture. For many right-handers, they're oblivious to this, but if you look at the right side of your screen, there are 4 handwriting postures. If you're like most right-handers, they're like the upper right-hand corner, so if you start writing, your pen points to the top of the page, and most of your hand is below the line of writing. Okay? But for left-handers, a fair number of them write with this inverted writing posture. Clearly, Obama does. One of the things we showed in our lab, and I think we were one of the first ones to show it, that male left-handers are more likely to be, and we call them hookers, got to be careful with that, than female left-handers. About 50% of all left-handed males write with this hook. Females, about a third. This actually got me in trouble once at a bank in New York. Luckily, my wife was with me because I was standing in line waiting for the teller. As I got closer, I noticed she was left-handed, and I noticed she wrote with this inverted writing posture. And under my breath, as I got closer, I said, oh, you're a hooker. And she did not take well to that at all. She motioned the cop over, and luckily I had my wife with me. Anyway, you got to be careful taking things out of the lab. What we do seem to know is that if you write with this posture, this hooking posture, you're most likely to be the left-handers who have left hemisphere language. Some of you might be thinking, oh, it's because we write English from left to right, which we do, okay? But we have done studies in Israel where they write Hebrew, and Hebrew goes from right to left. If it was simply an adaptation so you don't smear the paper or your ink when you're writing, you expect to find a lot of right-handed inverters writing Hebrew and very few left-handers. You don't. You find pretty much the same percentage. This has something to do with your brain. We're not quite sure what yet, but it does reflect something natural for you to do. All right, getting back to why it's important to know this about language. Left-handers are more bilateral in terms of language, and what we mean by that is regardless of which hemisphere has sophisticated language abilities, each hemisphere can do quite a bit, much more so than is true for right-handers. This is like a good news story, bad news story. Here's the disadvantage. If you are left-handed, whether you're male or female, you are more likely to become aphasic with damage to either hemisphere. So if I crash in on a mallet with either side of your head, you're likely to lose language. You say, oh my God, that's horrible. Here's the good part of this, right? Left-handers have almost like a built-in fail-safe system. So the prognosis for language recovery is better and faster because the other hemisphere can take over. For instance, if you go to a big VA hospital, and unfortunately right now with all the young people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a lot of people who've had circumscribed brain damage and become aphasic. There's large samples. If you walk into a room of people who are all aphasic and you point out to the same extent, same degree, if I ask you which ones are left-handed versus right-handed, the left-handers will almost always be the champions of the rehabilitation board. Neurosurgeons are well aware of this. So, and I think this is one of the reasons why left-handers exist, actually. They've existed since time immemorial. We can find cave paintings going back, and if you look to see it, about 10% of the cave people are holding the spear in their left hand, where about 90% is the right hand. Again, I think because our past history has always been very violent, a lot of brain injuries, and so a certain percentage of the population, about 10% left-handers, are much more likely to survive these incidents than are right-handers. Okay, as I promised, I want to talk a little bit about sighting eye dominance, and I'd ask you if you're sitting down to stand up for a minute. And so people are often amazed about sighting eye dominance. It becomes surprising to them. If you hold your finger in front of your face with both eyes open, hold your finger about 6 inches away, then ultimately open and close your eyes, you will see your finger will jump. All right? This is just physics, not psychology. This is physics, right? Each eye sees a slightly different view of the world. So here's the question I have for you. If you're trying to sight, say, a doorknob 15 or 20 feet away, which eye do you use? Do you do an average of both eyes to see it? And the answer is, no, you don't. All right. So first of all, to show you you've got a sighting eye dominance, if you stand up and see this person here, if you could put your palms together like this, and all right, there's a little opening there, and what I'd like you to do is to sight on an object, either someone's nose or a clock and so forth. And if you do that, then alternately open and close each eye. Okay, if you're doing that, you should find that when you close one eye, your hand seems to jump off. You don't see the clock anymore. But with the other eye, your eye is still aligned. That is your sighting dominant eye. Many people, when I do this in my intro sight class, they're amazed. Oh my God, I lived 18 years, I had no idea. And this has a lot of ramifications that we'll see in a moment for sports. So first of all, let me give you some statistics about this. This is actually data I collected in my dissertation way back in the 70s, and it pretty much still holds up. I, for example, I'm right-handed, but I'm left eye dominant for sighting. So my left eye is my sighting dominant eye. Approximately 25% of all right-handers, if I had you out there and I'm asking you right now, about 25% of you would probably raise your hand saying, yeah, I've got left eye dominant. As you can see, about 10% of right-handers aren't consistent. They'll switch back and forth. About 65% show right eye dominance. For left-handers, there it is again, they're more variable. About 50% will show left eye dominance. 15% will show no consistent dominance. About 35% will show right eye dominance. So let's see how this plays out in terms of sports, because it has a big effect. All right, so the question is, what do you mean by, if you say someone is congruent for hand-eye sightedness? Well, normally in my intro class, I'd wait for hands to go up. But what we're saying here is that the preference is on the same side. For instance, if you are both right-handed and right eye dominant for sighting, you are congruent. If you are left-handed and left eye dominant for sighting, you are congruent. Does this have an effect on playing sport? Yes, it does. Okay, for instance, if you are congruent, you have an advantage for all racket sports, and we'll see in a moment, bowling and rifle shooting. So for instance, if you're standing up again, okay, what I'd ask you to do is to hold your hand up like this, put it about 7 or 8 inches away from your head, and imagine this is a racket. For example, we play badminton a lot in our family, right? And then I'd ask you to close your right eye, right? Close your right eye, hold your hand out. So this is what it's like for me. I'm left eye dominant, right-handed. So if somebody hits the shuttlecock to me, I'm going to move my hand forward. If I do that, right, if you move your hand forward, your right eye shut, the first time you can see it with your left eye, which is my sighting dominant eye, is very late in my swing. Sighting dominant eye. So if you're crossed hand-eye dominant, you are at a disadvantage for all racket sports. In terms of bowling, it's well known. First of all, the best bowlers tend to be left-handed. If you look at the top 10 winners each year, about 20-25% are left-handed. It's easier to make the movement with the left hand into the strike pocket, but also sighting dominance is important. Those of you who shoot rifle, as you know, there's a sight on the gun. My colleague, Stanley Corn, the person who said left-handers die early, he had access to the Olympic athletes, rifle shooters for Canada. He gave them an option one. You could either shoot with your dominant hand, and again, when I mean shoot, you pull the trigger, you squeeze it slowly, and if you're really good, you squeeze it between heartbeats, right? You learn to do that through biofeedback. You squeeze it slowly, right, and then you sight on the sight. He said, would you rather, if I gave you an offer, to shoot with your dominant hand or your sight with your dominant eye? And the majority of them said, I would shoot, for example, if they're right-handed, I prefer, if I have to, I'll shoot it with my left hand as long as you let me use my dominant eye. So dominant eyes are really important. There's a disadvantage, though, also, if you are same-sided. So, for example, we have something called the center of gravity, which is sort of the balance point for the body. It tends to shift, and it tends to veer toward the dominant side. So, for instance, if you are, say, right-handed, right eye dominant, and soon we'll talk about footedness too, so you're also right-footed, then if you're swimming or running and so forth, as you know, you've got to stay in your lane, otherwise you get disqualified. Here's the problem. If you're running straight or swimming, right, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, but if you're veering slightly to the right or to the left, because you're all left-sided or all right-sided, you've got to make corrective strokes. That takes time. That takes energy, takes thought, all right? And at a small level, it probably doesn't make much difference. At a big level, though, it probably makes a huge difference. So, for example, people like Usain Bolt, the world's fastest human, my guess is he probably is cross hand-eye dominant. I'd be very surprised if he wasn't. I'd love to go check that out. All right. One last thing about baseball and softball, right? There's a special advantage for cross hand-eye sightedness. So again, for example, I'm right-handed and left eye sighting for dominance. So if I'm standing there in the typical right-handed stance, my bat's on over my right shoulder, and my dominant eye, my left eye, is looking right at the pitcher. That's an advantage for me. I can pick up the ball faster, see what kind of pitch is coming at me, and that's a real advantage. 2 years ago, I was talking with some people who have connections with Major League Baseball managers, and I said, baseball has all the statistics about people like weight, height, handedness, and so forth. They don't have anything about eye dominance. And my guess is when people switch hit, they're often switch hitting so they get this dominant eye in front. And by the way, you almost never get you get a lot of switch hitters, you almost never get a switch pitcher. It's extremely rare to be able to have somebody who can throw equally well with each hand. Here's this little quote I've got. His name is Babe Ruth. He is built like a bale of cotton and pitches left-handed for the Boston Red Sox. All left-handers are peculiar, and Babe is no exception because he can also bat. Then he got sold to the Yankees. Oh, terrible, terrible. Okay. Just a couple more minutes and we'll break off for questions. We also, I just mentioned before, have a preferred foot. Again, if you play soccer, they try to train you to use each foot equally often, but typically most people favor one foot or the other. So again, if I asked you to kick a ball at a target, pick up marbles with your toes, people are generally quite good with one foot, not as good as the other. They've actually done studies, and the better you are, the higher you go in professional soccer, the more ambi-footed you really are, which is a real advantage. We also have an ear dominance. People don't think about this very much, but when you listen to your cell phone, my guess is you probably pick it up and put it in the same ear every single time. I happen to be left ear dominant. I like this little Family Circus cartoon. She's saying to Jeffy, no, you have to whisper on my other side. I'm left-eared. I mean, there are people like that. And finally, we actually have a nostril difference, too. We have two nostrils. Some of you might remember Dave Horning from the biology department. Well, Dave and I, a couple of years ago, with a couple of honor students, did a study on nostrils. So if you can, for a moment, just breathe in deeply. Breathe in deeply, and if you're very perceptive, you'll notice that one of your nostrils is more open than the other one is. And this is actually called a nasal cycle, and it switches roughly every 90 minutes. Most people are unaware of this. What we did is we wanted to see if this varies as a function of handedness. So a few years ago, we got left-handed males and right-handed males, had them in a lab for 6 hours straight, one-on-one, and every 15 minutes we had them blowing into an apparatus which would measure how much each nostril was open. And what we found was, again, left-handers had their left nostril more open, right-handers had their right nostril more open. So again, there's these excitedness issues. All right, I want to conclude tonight with a little statement from Benjamin Franklin from 1779. By the way, Franklin is a strong right-hander. I love left-handers, and they often try to claim him as being left-handed. In some of the websites you go on, they'll name famous people like Michelangelo, who also was not left-handed, by the way, and they'll claim that Benjamin Franklin was a left-hander. He was not. He was a strong right-hander. Let me read to you this petition he has, a petition of the left hand. To those who have the superintendency of education, I address myself to all the friends of youth and conjure them to direct their compassionate regards to my unhappy fate in order to remove the prejudices of which I am the victim. There are twin sisters of us, and the two eyes of man do not more resemble, nor are capable of being upon better terms with each other than my sister and myself, were it not for the partiality of our parents, who make the most injurious distinctions between us. From my infancy, I have been led to consider my sister as a being of a more elevated rank. I was suffered to grow up without the least instruction, while nothing was spared in her education. She had masters to teach her writing, drawing, music, and other accomplishments. But if, by chance, I touched a pencil, a pen, or a needle, I was bitterly rebuked, and more than once I have been beaten for being awkward and wanting a graceful manner. It is true, my sister associated me with her upon some occasions, but she always made a point of taking the lead, calling upon me only from necessity or to figure by her side. But conceive not, sirs, that my complaints are instigated merely by vanity. No, my uneasiness is occasioned by an object much more serious. It is the practice in our family that the whole business of providing for subsistence falls upon my sister and myself. If any indisposition should attack my sister, and I mention it in confidence upon this occasion, that she is subject to the gout, the rheumatism, and cramp, without making mention of other accidents, what would be the fate of our poor family? Must not the regret of our parents be excessive at having placed so great a difference between sisters who are so perfectly equal? Alas, we must perish from distress, for it would not be in my power even to scrawl a suppliant petition for relief, having been obliged to employ the hand of another in transcribing the request which I have now the honor to prefer to you. Condescend, sirs, to make my parents sensible of the injustice of an exclusive tenderness, and of the necessity of distributing their care and affection among all their children equally. I am, with a profound respect, sirs, your obedient servant, the left hand. Okay, that concludes my formal comments, and we can take questions if you have questions now, or if you want to contact me later on, here's my email number. I'd love to hear, especially from alums, which I've known for years and years and years.
Okay, so we would like to now open the floor for questions. As a reminder, to ask a question, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. With over 200 participants, we may not get to everyone's question, but we will do our best. When you raise your hand, I will see the hand icon appear next to your name, and I'll call on you one at a time and unmute your line at that point. And then you'll have the opportunity to ask your question to Dr. Searleman, and other participants should be able to hear you at that point. So I'm just going to check our attendee list and see where we might have some hands up at this point. I hope that you have some questions out there for Dr. Searleman. Just kind of scrolling through the list now.
Do you have any questions or comments or interesting stories?
Okay, I see that Priscilla Sweet has a question. So Priscilla, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line, and then you should be able to ask your question. Priscilla, can you hear us? Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, you can hear me then, right?
I can hear you.
Okay, I have to apologize because I'm only following the very later instructions by Professor Searleman. That means you'll take comments. In one of my physics courses at Union College, there were 16 of us in the class, including the professor, and only one person was right-handed. That's all.
I remember you had mentioned that to me in an email. That's an extraordinarily large number of left-handers. That's remarkable.
Well, you did say that they tend to be high math achievers, and physics kind of uses math.
You're certainly right about that, but the numbers are astronomical. That's wild. Are you left-handed yourself?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, thank you for your comment.
Okay, we're just looking to see who else might have a question out there. Scrolling through our list of participants. Don't be shy. If you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand. I see that Jason Mendel has a question. So Jason, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line and give you the chance to ask a question. Okay, Jason, go ahead and ask your question.
I actually pushed that in air, so I apologize. But it's always a pleasure to have good folks and so many like-minded people on one connection here. So I appreciate you guys all taking the time to do this.
Okay, well, thank you, Jason.
Okay, I see that Hook Wang has a question as well, so I'm going to unmute you. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Hook.
Hi, Professor. Sorry, I was a little bit late, so I wasn't sure if you already mentioned this, but I would really like to hear your comment about certain cultures that has a preference for right-handedness. For example, Chinese, my native culture, where a lot of left-handed kids were actually being corrected into right-handedness. So I don't know what kind of consequence, and maybe you can comment on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hook. Actually, I met you earlier this year a little bit, and I had you a long time ago in class. I actually have 4 of the Chinese students in my class now, my intro class, and we talked a little bit about this. And again, they were saying that, yes, in mainland China, the strictures are still there where it's not appropriate typically to eat with the left hand, although it comes out in other ways sometimes, like when people throw a ball and so forth. But yeah, it's interesting. Taiwan, which genetically is very similar to the people on mainland China, they typically don't have the same kinds of strictures. So you can find about 8 to 10% of the typical Taiwanese are left-handed, but in mainland China typically it's a lot less. And what's also interesting is that when Chinese residents move to the United States or to Western culture, within 1 or 2 generations, their children are about right at 8 to 10%, 12% left-handed. So it's a great example of how a culture can change whether or not you objectively show right versus left-handedness.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Hook. Take care.
Okay, I see that Douglas Henderson has a question. So Douglas, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line now. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I was a little late getting on, and I don't think you covered this, but I'm a person who probably was one of those people who was forced to be a right-hander.
Okay.
And that's left me with a lot of questions. I understand now why I bat left-handed, because my dominant eye is right. But I guess my question is, how does one tell which hemisphere your language is in? I'm a class of 68 member. I'm 66 now, and one of these days I may need to know.
Huh. Okay, well, there's actually a number of different ways. One way is there's a drug which they could inject into your carotid arteries. It's called sodium amytal. What it does, it anesthetizes one hemisphere for like 2 to 5 minutes. So if it's your dominant language hemisphere, you'll be usually in bed because you're about ready to undergo brain surgery beforehand, because it's not a test you just do. And you'll stop. They'll ask you to count backwards from 10. You'll go 10, 9, 8, and if it's your speech hemisphere, you go 5, and then you can't speak for 2 to 5 minutes. They'll ask you questions. What's your favorite color? What do you like to eat? What's your middle name? You can't say a thing. Then once your hemisphere comes back, if that was the dominant hemisphere, you say, hi, my favorite color is purple. My middle name is whatever. They'll do it with both hemispheres if you're left-handed, and they'll see which one has a bigger effect. For the non-dominant hemisphere, you'll lose language for about 15 seconds. So your counting will start like this: 10, 9, 8, 7. The drug starts to take effect. 5, 4, and you'll continue on. That's one way they can tell. There's also brain imaging techniques they can use also, by putting you in an MRI and asking you to think about words, and they'll see whether or not your right or left hemisphere lights up more. That's another way of doing it.
Okay, it sounds like it would be an important thing then, if there is a brain event, to make one's neurologist aware that you may be a cross-dominant or someone who was forced to be right-handed when I should have been a lefty.
Absolutely, and in fact, if you have a neurologist who does not ask about your handedness and you're going in for brain, some sort of brain work, I would find another neurologist. I'm serious about that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to look and see if there are any other questions out there from participants. Okay, we have another question from Betsy Colber. Betsy, go ahead and ask your question.
Hello.
Hi there. I'm just wondering if you can speak to any genetic links towards left-handedness.
Sure. There are 2 or 3 genetic models out there, both actually by British psychologists. One's by Marion and Nett, another one's by McManus. But unfortunately, neither does a very good job in terms of explaining family handedness patterns. For instance, if you have 2 left-handed parents, the probability that you'll have a left-handed child is about 40% only. It's not 100%. If you are 2 right-handed folks, you have about a 10% chance of having a left-hander. And if you're a father who's left-handed, the chances go up to about 15%. But interestingly, it's more important if the mom is left-handed. If the mother is left-handed, we find roughly 20% of her offspring are going to be left-handed. The other thing which the models can't explain are handedness in twins. One of the very first studies I did when I was on Long Island, we collected data on over 75 monozygotic twins, those are identical twins, and 47 fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, and we were measuring a variety of things. And for a number of the twins who were monozygotic, again, they have exactly the same genes, a number of them are what we call mirror image twins. One is right-handed, one is left-handed, one is right eye dominant, one is left eye dominant, one has head hair whorls to the right, one has to the left. And again, genetic models of handedness cannot explain that at all. So it's a real open question right now, and a very interesting one. Are you left-handed yourself?
I am left-handed, and I had heard previously that if there was left-handedness on the mother's side of the family, then it was more likely that a child could be left-handed.
Right.
I work with children with special needs, and we have sometimes questions as to, because they're switching hands, well, which is going to become their preferred or their dominant hand. So I often ask if anyone on the mother's side has a history of left-handedness.
That's clever, yes. And in fact, just to sort of follow up, in terms of the development of handedness, during the first few months of life, infants often will switch hands, which they prefer to use, and it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing, because there are growth spurts for either the right or left hemispheres, and the left hemisphere controls the right hand, the right hemisphere controls the left hand. If there's a growth spurt for the right hemisphere, all of a sudden for 2 or 3 weeks, the child might be using his or her left hand a lot more. Then there's a growth spurt for the other hemisphere. It goes back and forth. By about age 3 or 4, it becomes pretty clear which hand the child typically will want to use. Thanks for your question, your comment.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, we're just checking to see if there are other questions out there from the group. Okay, we have a question from Bill Spees. Bill, go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Bill.
Bill, go ahead and try to ask your question. We can't hear you at the moment.
Okay, sorry, Bill. It doesn't look like we're making the connection.
Okay, Christy Fessler. Christy, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. Yeah,
Hi, Christy. How are you?
Hi, Alan. I'm curious if you, whether just in researching kind of the history of this bias against handedness in terms of, kind of it being an evil thing and so on and so forth. I'm sure that to some degree that the variability that you talked about, the higher tendency in both kind of positively viewed things and negatively viewed things, if you're aware of kind of how much that plays a role and why maybe, if that is the case, why there's more of a focus historically on maybe those negative things, so the tendency towards schizophrenia and so on.
Yeah, those are good questions. One of the things we think we know is that there's something called pathological left-handedness. A paper I wrote a long time ago looked at people when they're being born. It's called perinatal birth stress. So, for example, if a baby is born very underweight, if there's a problem with being able to breathe at birth and so forth, there's good evidence that these individuals are more likely to become left-handed. We think what's happening is the left hemisphere of the brain, which again controls the right side, for most of us that's genetically supposed to be happening. But the left hemisphere is also more vulnerable when you're an embryo. So if you have a problem in utero, it's more likely to cause your left hemisphere to have a problem. And if it does, one of the things it might do, it might cause you to be more susceptible to autoimmune disorders and so forth. For example, we've shown that type 1 diabetics are much more likely to be left-handed than type 2 diabetics. That's an autoimmune disorder. That if you have this problem with the left hemisphere early on, it's likely to switch you to become left-handed because your right hemisphere is still very good. Plus, and this is on a continuum, you might have some other problems based upon just the fact that you've done some minimal damage to the left hemisphere. This is a theory that's been going around for about 30 years. Does that sort of answer your question, or?
I'm good.
Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah,
or?
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. See you, Christy.
Okay, it looks like Gretchen Bates has a question. Gretchen, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I was just wondering, I actually got this seminar invitation right after I found out from taking up sporting clays that I was very right-hand dominant and extremely left-eye dominant. And it never even occurred to me that you could even, that could even be. And what the shooting instructor said to me is that so many golfers, professional golfers, that he's had have been left-eye dominant, right-handed. And I'm just, the whole thing was so shocking to me. And again, we have a child who had epilepsy, severe epilepsy, no epilepsy in the family. And I don't know, does that relate? What kind of issues do you see with people who are left-eye dominant, right-handed, or if there's anything, correlation?
Okay. Yeah, again, you were one of the people, like I said, like my students oftentimes, who are really surprised to find that they even have an eye dominance, and it's good to know. In fact, it's interesting. Some people are so dominant to the right or left side, I can see as they simply walk. So if you're left eye dominant for sighting, your head will be cocked slightly to the right, so your left eye is like walking straight ahead. It's sort of a game with me. I can sort of tell who's right versus left eye dominant. Regarding the epilepsy, that's a tough one. We do know that it is related to left-handedness, but again, this is only correlational. And there are many causes of epilepsy. Thankfully, it can often be treated quite well with things like Dilantin and so forth. I don't know of any problems other than like in terms of sports with being, say, like myself or like you, left eye dominant, strongly left eye dominant, and then also being right-handed. If you can come up with something, I'd like to think about it, but I don't know anything bad about it. But you're right about the sports, and a lot of people say, how can I not hit this right?
Yeah.
Some people like Phil Mickelson, they call him lefty, right? He does everything else with the right hand, but he's learned to play golf left-handed. Rafael Nadal, the same thing. His uncle taught him to be left-handed in terms of playing tennis, so he has that advantage, that surprise advantage over right-handers. But otherwise than that, he's a complete right-hander.
So interesting.
Thanks for your question. That was
Thank you so much.
Okay, I see we have a question from Jared Capro. Jared, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Searleman. I was interested in knowing, I'm a teacher at an all-boys middle school. I was interested in knowing if there's something we could be doing as educators to help our left-handed students more than we are already doing.
That's a great question. In this enlightened time, no one's trying to force people in the Western society to switch from left-hand writing to right-hand writing. And again, in terms of, you said you have middle school kids? So
That's right, grades 6 through 9.
Okay, well, I give you a lot of credit. That's a tough age to deal with.
Thanks.
But yeah, there's nothing special, I would say, other than, you know, the simple things, like, again, in terms of, like, seating arrangements, right? So you want to make sure that the left-hander is not bumping his elbow into somebody who's right-handed. Little things like, you know, scissors. If they're using scissors, you can purchase, you know, left-handed pairs of scissors and rulers, those simple little things. Even notebooks. Left-handers often struggle because the notebook, to rest your hand, you have to put your hand over the spirals, and it hurts. So you can get special notebooks and so forth. There's also special techniques for teaching left-handers how to write nicely, neatly, because, again, if you yourself are right-handed, are you right-handed?
I am, yeah.
Okay, so if they use you as a model, that's difficult for them sometimes. So, again, there are books out there that you can buy which will help them with a variety of things.
Great, I appreciate it. I'll look into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared.
Okay, it looks like Jeannie Nordsey has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Searleman. I have a question that relates to the earlier question about genetics. And I heard earlier in the presentation, I heard you say something about when left-handedness can run in families or not run in families. And I just always thought it must run in families because it runs in my family. But how does it not run in families, or is it just when it shows up once and then it skips generations or something?
Sure. It definitely does run in families. The question I was trying to answer earlier is whether or not it's genetic. And it is genetic, but it's not genetic in any simple Mendelian way, which makes it very difficult to understand. So, like I said before, if you have two left-handed parents, you're much more likely to be left-handed. Clearly, genetics is involved there. But again, there are certainly environmental factors as well. And it can skip generations sometimes. We know even less about sighting eye dominance. We know that also tends to be genetic, but we know very little about it. Are you related to Doug Nordsey, by the way?
Yes, he's my brother, and he is left-handed.
I remember Doug, yes. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for your call.
Okay, it looks like Julie Parker has a question. Go ahead, Julie.
Hi. I have actually two questions that aren't really related. One of them has to do with, you were talking about having consistent hand-eye dominance as being a disadvantage with respect to sports that involve center of gravity. And I'm wondering if there's been studies of whether that's offset, if you know, these other body parts that have preferences like feet and ears are, for example, the opposite side dominance. And then the second question is, have there been any studies done to see whether this, since there is a genetic component, that the same kind of like handedness and eye dominance might exist in other primates?
That's a real, let me answer the first question, the second question first. We do know that animals definitely have, say, paw preferences. I teach a course in research methods when we deal with rats, and each rat has a particular paw preference, either left or right. What's different about humans is that population-wide, we are about 90% right-handed versus 10% left-handed. In almost all other species, it's roughly 50-50. There are some exceptions. Some of the monkeys and some of the great apes are more likely to be right-handed also, or right-pawed. But by far, in terms of all the mammals, we are the ones which are most, as you might put it, lopsided in terms of being mostly right-sided. Regarding your other question about whether some of the other things like earedness and so forth could offset the eye-hand coordination in terms of congruence, typically not, because earedness is not that important in terms of things. So again, just repeating what I said before, if you have dominant-sided, right eye, right foot, right hand, again, you tend to move to that right side. And even as you walk, if you have a right-handed person who's right-footed, just say walk straight, like if you're in a field, they will tend to turn to the right. Left-handers, if you're left-handed and left-footed, you will tend to turn to the left. You might not even be aware of it, but we have these sort of natural turning tendencies. People who run museums know this, and they actually put their better exhibits on the right side when you walk into a museum because they realize that most people are going to be turning to the right. Those are good questions. Thank you, Julie.
Okay, it looks like Meg Bazone has a question. Meg, go ahead.
Hi, Meg.
Oh, hi, Dr. Searleman, Alan. I was just thinking that I wonder if celiac disease is related to being left-handed, because my mom has it and she was switched, and often celiac disease is the root cause of other autoimmune things and epilepsy and stuff like that. So I think that would be interesting to see if there was a relationship.
That's a great question, and in fact, we have evidence from our own lab that certain inflammatory bowel disorders like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, we did some studies on this. We sent out brochures, questionnaires to the national organization, and we got back results suggesting that about twice as many people have these autoimmune disorders of the gut, particularly. And so, again, it seems like there's this constellation of symptoms which left-handers are more likely sometimes to have. I don't know about celiac disease in particular, but that would make sense to me as well.
That'd be, well, thanks. It's cool.
Nice to hear from you, Meg.
Okay, just checking to see if there are any other questions that are out there. All right, it looks like Andrea Marsters has a question. Andrea, go ahead.
Hi, Alan. How are you?
Hi. You might have realized that the study I was describing was a study you and I published. Remember that way back?
It did sound quite familiar. So
my
question
part of your honors project back in the 80s.
Yeah. You had mentioned about pathological left-handedness and an association with autoimmune disease. So I wasn't really familiar with the idea of pathological left-handedness as opposed to, say, genetic left-handedness.
Right.
And do you think the correlation then with autoimmune disease, is that really specific to pathological left-handedness?
It is not. So there are a number of left-handers who had perfectly normal births, no problems at all. They had APGAR scores of 9 or 10 when they were first born, those scores you get, and yet they still have these disorders. So there's not a strong correlation with that. And again, the notion is that I think most left-handers are left-handed because of genetic reasons. I think only a small subset are what we call these pathological left-handers, those who had some sort of problem in utero or at the time of birth, which caused them to switch from what they should have been, naturally, a right-hander into becoming a left-hander.
Okay, thanks.
Take care.
Okay. We're just checking to see if there are any other questions out there before we conclude tonight's lecture.
While Kim is checking through the list, just like to remind you, I'd love to hear from any of you. I will email you back. I'm real good about emailing, and I'd especially like to hear from some of my old former students to see how life has been treating you.
All right, it looks like Karen Strauss has a question. So Karen, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. Personally, I'm left-eye dominant, very right-hand dominant. I'm the mother of 2 left-handed girls, and I'd really love for you to elaborate on the connection between the handedness and dominance and autoimmune, specifically if there are any ways to combat that association or linkage by the individual.
Okay. Interesting, you have 2 left-handed girls. How old are they?
They're both in their 20s.
Oh, okay. Do they have any issues right now?
Not related to handedness.
Okay. Well, yeah. I've got three children, adults are in their 20s too, and I know exactly what you mean. Okay. Again, regarding the notion of the autoimmune disorders, again, this is statistical, but it has been shown that people who are left-handed are more likely to suffer from diseases in which the body turns upon itself. Again, that's what we mean by autoimmune. So as I said before, people who are type 1 diabetics, particularly males, are much more likely to be left-handed than not. We're not sure why this occurs. And again, research is still going on about this. And again, there are subsets of left-handers. So for example, some of you out there are what we might call inconsistent left-handers. So yes, you like to use your left hand for writing, but you actually prefer and are better at scrolling with your right hand. About 20% of left-handers fall into this category, what we call inconsistent left-handers. We don't know why you do this, but you do this. For right-handers, it's extremely rare for a right-hander to throw with the right hand, to write with the right hand. You have to prefer and to throw better with the left hand. So again, left-handers, like I said, they're more variable. They're fun to study. Right-handers are like chocolate men. They're all the same. To me, left-handers are what really makes the world interesting to study.
Okay. Well, thank you for your work. It's fascinating.
Well, thank you for calling in.
Okay, I see at least one other question out there. Bill Spies, I think we tried you before, Bill, and we weren't able to hear you, so I'm going to try again. Bill, do you have a question? Bill, go ahead and ask your question. Okay, we're not able to hear you.
Bill.
Sorry about that. Okay, I think that we've managed to get to everyone's questions, but as Dr. Searleman said before, if we didn't get to your question tonight, or if you have additional questions, please feel free to email Dr. Searleman at the email address that you still see up on your screen. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's lecture and discussion, and immediately following the webinar, you should receive a brief survey that I hope you'll take a moment to complete, as your feedback will be very helpful to us moving forward, as we hope to have many lectures like this moving forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for tuning in.
Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you so much.